Hi everyone, today's video lecture is on industrialization during the Gilded Age, and we'll go through some of the notes together here. This is the big story, I think, of the Gilded Age, is the transformation of the American economy from small farms, small businesses, to a really industrialized country dominated by large corporations and big businesses. And so that has a huge impact on the individual. Some things like politics, I think really, what impact does that really have on a typical person's life? Oftentimes, not a huge amount unless there's a war. This is something that really impacts everyone's day-to-day living as more and more people are working for someone else, which was a pretty new idea then, to work for someone else. Common today, most common today, but a pretty new idea back then, led by new technology, transportation, railroads becoming more and more efficient, and mass production becomes the big story of the time. For producing something like iron, to produce that on a small level individually is not going to work. Instead, you are going to have huge companies with huge furnaces, huge plants, producing enormous amounts all together to take advantage of those economies of scale as they're known, that it becomes much more efficient to produce some things if you're doing it on a large scale compared to small amounts at a time. And by the end of the century, America will be the most industrialized country in the world as we become a world power. I really think this is what makes us a world power, this industrialization. And we have a few statistics today, not that you have to memorize these, but just to give you an idea of how transformative this was. And the word sweatshops should bring certain connotations used today, and those were true back then as well, that these are places where wages are low, hours are long, and conditions are often unhealthy and dangerous. In the steel industry, in a typical year in the late 1800s, about 1,000 people died. That was seen as just the cost of doing business at that time. We see the number of patents being issued as more new things are being invented, new technologies. You'll read about some of them in the textbook, but some important things like the telephone, pretty big deal. We see steel production. Steel is the essential element of industrialization in this age, and it really takes off in the United States. And again, by 1914, the start of World War I, we are perhaps now the most important country in the world. We don't really recognize it. The rest of the world doesn't fully recognize it in 1914, but because of this industrialization, we have become a world power, if not the world power. And so that should hopefully bring up some questions of why. How does that happen? How do we surpass everyone else so quickly? A big part of it is natural resources. For something like steel production, you need coal and iron. Coal to heat those furnaces, iron to make steel, and we've got it in abundance. If you want to lay thousands of miles of railroad, you also need a lot of timber. We've got that in abundance. You also need a lot of workers. We've got that in abundance. A lot of immigrant workers coming in, a lot of former farmers. The farms really mechanized a lot during the Civil War because there was a shortage of laborers. So many farmers were going off to fight in the war. At the same time, prices were high for something like wheat because we had to feed an army. And so with prices high but not many workers, the solution was get machines to do some of the work for us. It was a big investment to buy those machines, but this really accelerates that process, the Civil War. And once that starts, we never go backwards on that. So the Civil War we see has an impact on a lot of these things in pushing us towards more efficient, more mechanized production. It also provides a lot of the capital, the money to start these investments, to start these businesses, to buy those machines. A lot of that money is originally made in the Civil War, some of it from pretty seedy beginnings with war profiteers. And we'll also talk about the role of government in the next slide. And again, new inventions like the Bessemer steel making process, better steam engines, the telephone, all of these work together to build this up. One example is going to be the Transcontinental Railroad. Ideas of this had started ever since we gained territory in the Mexican-American War. Always debates, would it be north or south? It would be so valuable to whatever region got it. And so it's a big debate of who's going to get it. We figured it's going to be so expensive, we're only going to build one. Once the Civil War starts, that debate kind of disappears. We decide to build in the north, although it won't really get built until after the war is over, since we're pretty busy fighting the Civil War. And it's built really quickly, though, then. We give huge land grants to the companies that are hired, given contracts to build the railroad. And because they're paid so much for every mile of track paid in land, they've got a real incentive to build as much as they can so that they can build more miles before the other company coming from the other side completes theirs. And they do meet in Promontory Point, Utah. That's the picture on the bottom right there. And it is worth noting who is doing the actual building here. Immigrant laborers, mostly Irish on the eastern side, mostly Chinese on the western side. Although we thought we'd build only one of those transcontinental railroads, we built several more over the next couple of decades because they become so valuable. And here's where the government again steps in and provides a lot of the money and the investment for this, again through land. Land grants will eventually give the railroad companies the equivalent of Texas in total land grants. And we felt like this was necessary because we have a real tricky problem of the railroads don't want to build a railroad, or the railroad companies don't want to build any railroad lines where there's no settlers yet, because that's not going to be profitable. But at the same time, settlers aren't going to come in until there's a railroad, because otherwise, how can they possibly get the things they're producing back to a place like Chicago to sell it? It would be impossible for them to be successful without the railroad. Railroad can't be successful until the settlers are there. And so how are we going to break that impasse? And the solution was the government stepping in, providing a huge investment opportunity for the railroad companies through these land grants. And they say, we need these. We need it for settlements, for other government purposes like the military and the mail. These are necessary. And so the government will get very involved in building those railroads. And it'll come at some backlash as railroads are given so much of the country through all of this land. And there'll be some anger over the railroad companies that we'll see pretty soon. Because there's also this potential for corruption. If the government is so involved in the business, certainly now we have businessmen and politicians working hand in hand. That's always a recipe for corruption, especially in an era of almost no oversight. But they do a lot of good for the economy. Certainly historians have argued too, coming from the Civil War and Reconstruction, this is a big part in binding the country together politically as well and socially, as people are moving around and becoming more economically tied together. Opens up new areas for settlement, of course. This is where we get the time zones. And then a big part of the discussion in the end of this week will be the millionaires that are created, this new class of extremely wealthy Americans who become extremely powerful. New chances for corruption, and then the backlash of the American people against them. This is a time of pretty heavy class warfare between the lower and this newly formed ultra-rich upper class. And we see a quote here from Vanderbilt, who is one of the first of that class of extremely rich railroad tycoons, and just how powerful they are. And there's real concerns about, in a country founded on democratic principles, should our most powerful people be democratically elected? And is that the case anymore? Vanderbilt's maybe one of the most powerful people in the country. We did not choose him to be that. He kind of made it himself. And so there's some concerns about that. And there'll be some efforts to bring those railroads under control because of that corruption. A lot of concerns about the rates that they were charging because everyone was so dependent on those railroads. If you were going between Chicago and New York, there's going to be competition. There's going to be more than one company that you can take. And because there's competition, the way it works in capitalism is you have to keep your price low, because if your price isn't low, people are going to go with a different company. That works when there's competition. If you're in a really rural area where there is only one railroad company, there is no competition, and they can really charge whatever they want then. And so that's the people that the small farmers are dealing with. So big companies in between big cities, they've got low rates. The farmers out in the West, they often pay significantly more to go a shorter distance. And this would really infuriate the farmers. And again, we'll see at the end of this unit some of that backlash from them. And another really important development from this is the Interstate Commerce Act. Although it's not particularly effective, it establishes the principle that the government needs to start getting involved in regulating business more. It's going to be the beginning of the end of that laissez-faire, hands-off capitalism, where the government doesn't see itself as having any role in the economy. That will start to change here. As these companies become so powerful, people start to think, who can possibly rein them in? The small farmer can't do it. The average businessman can't do it. Even larger companies are having real trouble doing it. Perhaps the only other entity powerful enough will be the federal government. Perhaps they're going to have to be the ones to step in and try to establish public interest over private profit. That's the end of our lecture for today. I'll see you guys back in class, and we'll look at some of these documents together. Thanks for joining.